Morning. I'm Michelle McAvoy, Communications Officer at the New York State Health Foundation, and welcome to NYS Health's Practically Speaking webinar series, where we talk to experts who can share ideas and models on a range of issues to better serve New Yorkers during the pandemic. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Pitching Media During COVID-19, which will focus on helpful tips that nonprofits can use to share their stories and impact with media. Before we begin, just a few things to note. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a recap with a link to the recording and presentation materials will be sent out to everyone who's registered. And video and audio functions are disabled for the audience. So any questions that you do have, please go ahead and type those into the chat box. And when we turn to the Q&A part of our webinar today, I'll read those questions to our panelists. So it is my pleasure to now introduce Beth DeFalco, a former journalist and now managing director at Mercury Public Affairs. And Beth is going to talk to us today about how nonprofits can build effective relationships with and pitch to the media during the pandemic. Beth, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody about this. I prepared a few slides to make sure that I can stay on track with what I wanted to say and give you guys an idea. You can follow along with me. I've been working with the foundation for about a year and a half now. A little bit about my background. I was in journalism for 15 years. Worked for everything from the Associated Press to the New York Post. And then decided to, after covering politics for a long time, to go on to the other side and work in politics. I worked for Governor Cuomo, Senator Booker, and was the communications director for the New York City subway. And also did some philanthropic work with Bloomberg Philanthropies. I did a little hurricane recovery work in the Virgin Islands after hurricanes Irma and Maria. And then decided to move into the private sector to see how I could use sort of my skills on both sides of the fence. And apply them, in other places like the foundation. Let me click over to the next slide. So what is news? It's, I sort of joke about this, but you can't have news without something actually being new. And so one of the ways, if you're a nonprofit or foundation, to think about it is, if you're pitching something or trying to get some media attention and it's your third annual event, that right there tells journalists that it's probably not new, right? It's not the first time it's happened. So they're really looking for something that is a first of some sort, something unusual, something that is either the best or the worst. Not to oversimplify it, but they're trying to explain to people why they should care. So they kind of look at these different boxes and areas to think about. And also if something's a trend. So if it's not new, but it's something that is a new trend. So you're seeing something happen over and over again, but people aren't really talking about it in terms of, the collective, then that's something that editors and newsrooms are interested in. We can click over the next one. So pitching during COVID, which is very much the same, but also very different. To some extent, media has lower expectations. And what do we mean by this? It means that media no longer they're no longer running out to the scene of an event or covering things live in the same way. So on the upside, the opportunity is that they are willing to accept more Skype interviews and the quality of photos and things that aren't normally they would say it's not high enough quality. They're willing to accept it now, which is great, because I think that there's more opportunity in that for people to get things across just because they're not in HD quality or the perfect photo. The other upside is that it's easier accessibility. You can do interviews on Zoom and Skype and FaceTime. And they're willing to accept that. So you get rid of a lot of logistical problems. Reporters don't have to come out and, actually, you don't have to go to a studio, or they don't have to come out to the scene of an event. And it also means that there's the opportunity for them to use more of your photos and your pictures and your videos, where they normally would want to, have their own photographer shoot it. They're more flexible, which is great because it gives us more opportunity. Go to the next one. So how to get attention. Um, there's a couple of different ways, more than a couple, but I think the most standard ones that people think of are press releases and email pitches. And those two things are kind of different. A press release is sort of a little more formal format. And then obviously email pitches are mostly how most folks will do pitches to start, unless you've got a relationship with a reporter or editor. But that means that you've got to sort of figure out this way to sell yourself in email, which can be really difficult, I think, even for me, and sometimes even difficult when you have relationships with people. So things to think about in your pitch, even if it's a press release or if it's just a more informal email pitch. The one thing that everybody's going to ask about, and I'll say this several times throughout this talk, is pictures and video. When I was a reporter at the New York Post, my editor, used to say it's about pictures and quotes, but mostly pictures. I knew that if I didn't have a great photo that went with whatever story I was writing, it would never be a cover story. No such thing as a cover story without a photo. So that's really something to think about when you're doing events, or like what you're capturing, because that's going to really help you sell your story. You're going to need somebody to go on record, somebody for them to interview. So if you're pitching a story, whether that's your CEO, whether that is your policy expert, whoever it might be, they're going to actually want to put their name to it. So you might want to think about that and who that's going to be before you start the pitch process, because that's one of the first things they'll ask for. And then the best thing is to have also, and this shouldn't be your responsibility, but it is, if you actually want to get it pitched, is an example. So, reporters have less and less time to go and spend on each story. And that means that we really have to present stories to them that is kind of already made and prepared and have a bow on top of it, and they just have to do a little bit of work. Those types of pitches tend to be the most successful. So really got to find somebody who's an example of whatever it is, whatever story we're trying to get them to write. So maybe that's one of your clients, maybe that is a patient or a grantee or somebody who had great success with the program, or in basically another person to validate what it is you're saying, another person for them to be able to tell the story through. To that extent, they love newsrooms, editors of any sort, love exclusives. So that's one of the first things that they think about too. Are we the only one that's going to have it? Is this going to everybody? And that can be tough, because some stories really make sense to do an exclusive or give to somebody first and others don't. But often what I will do is think about if it's a good story and we're trying to get attention of a top tier media organization, I will often target that with an exclusive and just give it to them first, because I know that I'm more likely to get them to be interested in it. If it's something that I don't think a top tier organization, somebody like the Wall Street Journal or New York Times is going to grab, then maybe you sort of think about putting it out in mass, or in a bigger distribution method. So, and then one thing to talk about that I think is really important, because I remember seeing this a lot in newsrooms, is events by themselves are not stories. They're just events. So trying to get a reporter to come out to, your gala or your fundraiser is not like they don't have a story. A fundraiser, it's, unless it's a very, very, very hyper local news outlet, odds are they're probably not gonna do much with it, because they get a million of those and there's nothing unusual or new or a trend about them. So okay, we'll move on to the next one. Outreach. How do you find the people who care about your story, or how do you know who to go to? And when we were talking about doing this webinar, one of the things that we were talking about is that not everybody can afford a public relations agency. And it's great if you can, because we certainly understand this and make quick work of things. But if you can't, then there are some tips that we can, these are ways that'll help you sort of do a little bit of what we do, in order to get attention. So the first thing you got to figure out is who is it that's the right audience for this? Who's been writing about it is usually the first thing that I think about. Like, people who care about what you're doing probably cared about it before you were doing it. So if it's a health story, you know, who is the health reporter that has been writing about vaping? Who is the health reporter that has been writing about, you know, maternal morbidity, whatever it might be? I think that the great way to think about it is just who's going to be your target. Don't pitch to a political reporter if it's a health story, or don't pitch to, you know, a sports reporter something that is, you know, like about a food kitchen. It's never going to happen. I know it sounds overly simplistic to say, but it really means that you got to sort of do a little bit of research or Googling to figure out who's been writing about it. Direct reporter outreach is great. So once you figure out who the reporter is, you usually can, you know, do a little digging, a few Google searches to find out an email address or contact information. But you should also think about editors too, because often reporters will come into a newsroom, editors will see pitches and they say, you're going to do this and you're going to do that. So you want to target the people who are making decisions as much as you're targeting the reporters. Usually what I tend to do is, what are the 5 outlets where I would be really happy if any one of them wrote about it? That's kind of a manageable way, I think, to approach it or to start off. So if you can identify those, and then you can say, all right, who would I want it the most to do something on it, and start with them, and then you can move down to the others. That sort of helps you get your arms around it. I always email, and then I also call. I'll call reporters, I'll call the assignment desk. And, you know, emails are really easy to ignore. Reporters get hundreds and hundreds of them a day. So, you know, getting their attention over email can be tough. In terms of actually figuring out who the reporters are, how to contact them, I mean, usually you can figure it out through Google, but often through social media. So I wouldn't be hesitant about doing a direct message through Twitter if that's the only contact information that you have for a reporter. I've done it, and I've done it successfully. So, you know, you can think about that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. What are editors and reporters looking for? Like, these are the questions that they are asking themselves when you pitch them. And you know, if you call a reporter up and say, you know, you should really write about the homeless crisis in New York City, that's not a story idea. That's just a topic idea. That we're not gonna be able to write about that without doing a lot of work first. So the things that they're asking is like, why now? Why do people need to know about this? Like, why do I have to tell the audience that? And, you know, when you talk about what's the problem at the center of it, you know, if you're pitching a story, is it really a story that's an example of a much bigger, deeper seated problem? Because that will get you more attention if you can articulate that. You know, how is it that you solve this problem? That's always the question that gets asked. It's like, all right, well, we have a problem, but everyone wants to know, how do you fix it? And you don't always have to have the answers about how to fix it, but maybe you've got an idea about who can help fix it or who should be responsible for fixing it. How does it translate into a broader policy context? I think that this can be really helpful if there is a law or a regulation that might help fix or address the problems that you're working on. That will get you more attention and from a broader audience. And then hasn't been covered by other outlets. That can be a double-edged sword. Obviously, everybody loves exclusives, but also if other people have been covering it, you've got a new or interesting way to get into it. Reporters and editors would be really interested in that as well. Okay, go to the next one. Visual stories. I talk a lot about pictures, but I can't overemphasize how important this can be. You know, we talk about showing and telling a story, but really showing it. So the photo that you're seeing on the screen now is one when I was in the Virgin Islands, when I went down there for about 6 months. The first thing I did when I went down there was to take pictures of how bad everything was, because I knew that they would get better. And when they did, I wanted to be able to show how we were able to help with that. So, often you don't know how things are going to turn out, like what things will get better, what things won't. So I always just say, shoot first and decide later. That's kind of like the photographer, the newsman's mantra. You can't make a decision about a picture you don't have. So if you're at, taking a picture of something, you're like, I wonder if the people in this photo are going to be okay with us sharing with news media. Don't worry about it. You can make that decision later. Take it first and then figure out what to do. And in terms of what types of photos you're looking for, photos that show, progression, a contrast before and after, like what you're seeing on this slide, or just any sort of a story that can be told through the photos, and sort of comparing them can be great. Okay, we pop to the next one. That's actually the last one. So with that, if you have any questions or anything else that I can be helpful with, I'll toss it over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Beth. So thank you. Definitely some useful tips and strategies to kick us off with. Just a reminder to the audience, if you do have questions, go ahead and add those into the chat box, and then we can get those over to Beth. But to kick things off, Beth, so, I think those are, great tips and strategies that we can use, anytime as we're thinking, nonprofits are thinking about pitching their story. But the times that we live in now under COVID and the pandemic, where, so many people are overstretched and under-resourced, both journalists and newsrooms and nonprofits themselves. How do you think nonprofits can sort of best position themselves with the media during the coronavirus crisis without seeming maybe tone deaf or opportunistic? What should they be pitching right now? And maybe what should they avoid?
No, it's a really good question. I think I would say that, like, you should own your pitch. Like, and what I mean by own it is, odds are, if you're a nonprofit, you're trying to help people. And that's a good thing. It's not necessarily opportunistic. So the more people who know about it, the better and the easier it will be for you to help other people. And I think if you sort of couch it that way, then reporters will appreciate what you're trying to do, that it's not just about a headline, but if you've got a great program and nobody knows about it, if a tree falls in a forest. So don't feel bad about pitching that, or feel like it's not humble enough. Because I think a lot of nonprofits, try to do good work and try to stay humble about it, but that doesn't always necessarily serve everybody you're trying to serve. However, I will say, though, in these particular times, and I sort of talk about pitching the fundraiser at the gala, I think that, reporters have less patience for, like, what they consider to be fluff stories than they did before. So if you're pitching that kind of stuff, you're going to have a much steeper uphill climb, and that might turn reporters off a little bit, unless you have a relationship with them.
Maybe, like, what would be a fluff thing to sort of put that in perspective? Like you said, maybe like a gala event, but would you think say, it's a nonprofit that they're doing, after school programming for kids, now moving like exercise programs and on Zoom, maybe somebody's not sure, like, is this too much of a light thing to pitch, or less interesting for reporters?
I think that, sometimes it's okay to ask them too. Like, I think that reporters, as long as you explain to them, like, listen, I don't want to waste your time. Do you think that this is something that would be interesting? Usually they'll tell you yes or no. And if you let them know that you would rather have them just, give you an answer either way, so you don't waste your time, like, they get that. Listen, maybe a fundraiser isn't interesting unless you have a really interesting person who's going to be headlining it. Because then, right, like, then it's if Hillary Clinton is going to be headlining your fundraiser, it might be interesting to maybe not the health reporters, but maybe the political reporters. So you can think of it that way. But I think it's okay to just ask them, and having that conversation will help you start the relationship.
So we do have a question from the audience, and this, I think, dovetails nicely with what I've been thinking about too. It's talking about email pitches, and what makes for a good email heading to catch the attention of a reporter, like, you know, a subject line? And then maybe what are some of the most important elements to put in that body of an email pitch, Beth?
It's a really good question. So I often encourage people to write their own headline before pitching. Like, what do you want? As I like to work backward, what do you want the headline of the story that you are hoping to get placed to be? And sometimes when you write that headline, you'll realize you're like, that's not very interesting. So then you can go back and think about how to make it more interesting. But I think that that headline makes a really big difference. And having that headline in the story also makes a difference. Often I will write, especially if it's like if I'm doing an exclusive pitch, I'll write exclusive opportunity, you know, interview with X about this topic. And then in the first or second sentence, you know, talk to, you know, hi, Joe. I wanted to see if you want to do a report about, talk to us or are interested in doing a story about, and then sort of put that headline in that first sentence. Just get to the chase, because odds are they might not be reading much beyond that. So I think that that becomes very important. And then in the body, you kind of want to have all of the relevant background information. Like, you want to have in an email something that a reporter, they've got all of the facts that they need to be able to then go and pitch it to their editor, right? So maybe they'll take your press release or your pitch and say, oh, this person's coming here. Like, it's the who, what, why, when. And then a little bit of background about who you are, assuming that the reporter has no idea about what you do and why it's important. And keeping it concise is really important. So having a paragraph or two tops about what you do is where I'd keep it, you know, at most. If you're writing more than 500 words in an email, it's way, way, way too long.
So less is best in these.
Yes.
Great. So another great question. So during COVID, you know, many of us are having to share the same messages over and over again, particularly when it comes to, for example, you know, wear masks, wash your hands, social distancing. How can nonprofits sort of effectively keep pitching the same messages over and over again and get the coverage?
I mean, listen, that's the big challenge, right? Because reporters are hearing the same thing from all these different places. So I think you have to, one, it's a little bit of a challenge to be creative in what you're doing. And so if your message is, you know, talking about wearing masks, then I think that you have to think about, like, how does that work? Like, when I think about that more creatively, like, okay, how do you make kids wear masks? Like that's going to be a really challenge, you know, a big challenge, but it's really important to the, so I think that will force you to just sort of think a little bit outside of the box in terms of, if it's the same message, then what can you do that has a different angle to it? What can you do as a nonprofit that isn't being done everywhere else? How do you fill a gap that's not being, you know, filled? I mean, listen, maybe that's making a mask that fits differently, right? Because adult masks don't fit kids. Maybe that's something that you want to throw money toward. And, you know, I don't know, but like, it's that kind of thing where you're going to have to, that's going to challenge you to be a little more creative about maybe what you're doing, which is great. Like, sometimes press can actually shape policy in good ways, I think. And so, yeah, I don't have an easy answer other than to challenge you to be a little more creative if you're trying to get out in front of it, or to do partnerships. Like, if there are 4 of you that have the same message and, you know, you're trying to get attention, it might make sense to do a coalition or to all come together so that you can organize something bigger, or, like, you know, more grand, for lack of a better term. So that might be something to think about, and then sort of simplify that under the headline of a coalition.
So a little bit of maybe, you know, coming together and looking at, so you're not duplicating efforts, but if it makes sense to sort of partner with, you know, another local nonprofit or community-based organization that's doing similar work, maybe you can think about pitching it as like a campaign for your community that might get a reporter's attention as an idea. So another question we have here is, because you talked a little bit about how to find reporters and doing your research for journalists, but how should people be identifying and reaching bloggers? Is that sort of a way to get in or to get your story told.
Yeah, it absolutely is. You know, one of the problem with losing smaller newspapers and outlets and is that the bigger news outlets get their story ideas from the local community outlets. So when I was at the Associated Press, that was, you know, often what we would do is look around. Like I worked in New Jersey for the last part of my tenure there. And so we'd look around at all of the different community papers and see what they were running each day to sort of figure out what the news was there, which seems like cheating because it's just what you did. You didn't have enough people to cover it that locally yourself. So if you can get something, especially if what you're doing is a local idea or concept, like maybe you're doing something that has a bigger effect, but you're doing it in this one particular community. A lot of bloggers are very influential. And so, you know, you can ask reporters what blogs, if you don't know, you know, what ones they're reading. But yeah, I think it's great to get things in those local papers. They will get picked up often by the bigger outlets.
Right. Okay, so you've sent your pitch. Now what? How often and who else should you follow up with? I know you said, you know, it's really easy to overlook an email, give a telephone call. For folks who've really never done this before, like, do you wait 6 hours, 12 hours? I think maybe sometimes people get nervous, like I'm being too pushy, or, you know, what are some good sort of nuts and bolts, and that it's okay to reapproach a journalist or reporter?
I call it gentle pestering, but which is just pestering with a nice tone. So, but you should, because, you know, often if there's something that has a time limit to it, then you really do want to, you know, get out in front of it, or even ask them, is there something that would make you want to do the story? Is there something that it's missing that maybe we could help you get or come up with? And maybe they'll tell you. But you send the email. If you don't hear back from, you know, the reporter, you can certainly follow up an email and try and call them or text them if you can get their cell phone number. Sometimes I find that, like, that's a more important info stream for them. And, you know, just say, listen, I don't want to bother you, but did you see this? Because can I resend it to you so it hits the top of your inbox if you've got too many emails? And then I also try the editors and the assignment editors. And usually it does take a little bit of digging, but you can find them and just say, you know, send the email to assignment at, you know, WKRZ, and then call the main newsroom and ask for the assignment desk. It can't hurt. Like, the worst thing that happens is they tell you no and you're in the same position. So yeah, gentle pestering.
If first you don't succeed, try a couple more times again. So we're just about to wrap up, but maybe just one other thing to get nonprofits thinking ahead of the game and getting prepared, especially if they don't really have a particular or dedicated communications staff member. What can nonprofits be doing to be ready or prepared for a media request or interview if that comes up?
No, it's another good question. And I think that these can be, sometimes they pop up out of nowhere and they seem like great opportunities, but they're great opportunities if you're ready for them and know what you want to get out there. You know, for years I was a reporter, and then I was on the other side of it and had to do on-camera interviews that I had never done before, and certainly fumbled through many of my initial ones. I find that writing down your talking points, you know, often I would do this for, like, you know, the elected officials that I was working for, but then I just started doing it for myself. So write down the 5 things that you want to talk about. Rule of thumb in the TV interviews, if you can get 1 or 2 points across, then you've done a great job. So I think that if you just, even sometimes writing them down will help you commit them to memory. And then writing down the soundbite, not actually just the idea or the thing that you want to get across, but what's the 1 or 2 sentences, the way that you want them to come across. And I think of a soundbite is a sentence that you don't need to take a breath during. So, you know, that's 10 words, that's not 25 words. So come up with those 2 sentences that you think are really good, that if they did nothing else, if you got those 2 sentences in, they would be great. And then if you do nothing else, pop them in there. And then during the interview, even if they don't ask you about those 2 sentences, be like, wait, can I just add 1 more thing? because they won't be rude. They won't tell you no. They'll let you add the sentence in there. So I that's the most useful thing that I've done when I'm doing those types of interviews, and I think will be helpful for your CEOs or your policy folks or anybody who's gonna do an interview, even on the phone.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we're just about time to wrap up. Just as a reminder, we will send out the recap with a link to today's recorded webinar and Beth's slides. And if you'd like to learn more about upcoming webinars in our Practically Speaking series or any other NYS Health resources, please go to our website and sign up for our e-newsletter to get updates, or you can also follow us on Twitter to stay up to date. We're at NYS_health. And I'd like to thank Beth for giving us her time and expertise today. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining in. I hope you found it helpful.